George was born into a modest family in a small city. From a young age he displayed an unusual level of determination and intelligence. While other children played, George spent hours watching his father, a taxi driver, struggle to make ends meet. He promised himself he would break free from the cycle of poverty and create a life of luxury. By the time George was in his late teens, he had already started small businesses, selling anything he could get his hands on. With every little profit he saved and reinvested. After graduating with a degree in business management, he entered the oil and gas industry. He worked tirelessly, seizing every opportunity, making smart investments and networking with influential people. George's hard work paid off in his late 20s. By the time he was 30, he owned several petrol stations across the country and had diversified into real estate. He lived in a luxurious penthouse on the island, drove the latest cars and attended high-class events. People admired him, envied him and wanted to be him. However, behind the wealth and success, George had a cold, calculating side. He believed that money could solve any problem and get him anything he desired, including women. His charm, combined with his wealth, made him irresistible to many. He treated women as fleeting pleasures, not as partners or equals. To George, relationships were like business deals, temporary and transactional. Despite his wealth, George was a man of strict discipline when it came to his work. He managed his businesses with an iron hand, demanded excellence from his employees and rarely took time off. But outside work his discipline disappeared. He indulged in lavish parties, expensive drinks, and a revolving door of women who were drawn to his money and charm. On the surface, George appeared to have it all: a successful career, a luxurious lifestyle, and endless options when it came to romance. But deep down he carried a flawed belief that made him indifferent to the emotions of others. He thought love was an illusion, something only the weak believed in. For him, power, wealth, and control were all that mattered. It was a Friday evening, and George decided to visit one of the most exclusive bars in Westland. This wasn't unusual for him. The bar was known for its luxurious ambience, wealthy patrons, and an air of exclusivity. George liked the energy, the soft jazz music, and most of all, the attention he got every time he walked in. That night, the bar was as lively as ever. Crystal glasses sparkled under dim, golden lights. The hum of conversation mingled with the smooth tones of the piano. George strolled in wearing a perfectly tailored suit, exuding confidence. Heads turned as they always did, but George was focused. He wasn't looking for attention tonight, he was looking for something, or someone, different. Seated at a corner table was Cynthia. She wasn't flashy like most of the women who frequented the bar, but her presence was magnetic. Her hair framed her face perfectly and her smile lit up the room. Cynthia's soft laughter carried across the space, catching George's attention. Intrigued, George leaned against the bar, watching her for a moment. She seemed different, confident, but not in a way that sought validation. He turned to the bartender. "Who's that?" he asked, nodding toward Cynthia. "That's Cynthia," the bartender replied. "She's new around here. Quiet but sharp. People seem to like her." George nodded, intrigued. He was used to women who sought his attention, but Cynthia wasn't even looking his way. That only made her more appealing. George picked up his drink and walked toward her table. Standing tall and confident, he asked, "Is this seat taken?" Cynthia looked up, her eyes meeting his. She studied him for a moment before replying, "Not at all. Go ahead." He sat down, flashing his signature charming smile. "I'm George," he said, extending a hand. "And you are?" "Cynthia," she replied, shaking his hand. Her voice was calm, almost indifferent, but there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. "So Cynthia," George began, "what brings you here tonight? You don't seem like the usual crowd." She raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what exactly is the usual crowd?" George chuckled. "You know, people who come here to be seen. But you seem different. Like you're here for yourself, not for the show." Cynthia leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I just like good music and a nice drink." Their conversation flowed easily from that point. Cynthia told him about her passion for art and her dream of opening her own gallery. George listened, genuinely intrigued. Unlike most women he met, Cynthia wasn't impressed by his wealth or his accomplishments. She was ambitious and driven in her own way, and that intrigued him. "What about you?" Cynthia asked, breaking George's train of thought. What's your story? George hesitated for a moment. I'm in oil and gas, he said simply. I own a few businesses. A few? Cynthia teased. Modest, aren't we? George laughed. He liked that she could tease him without trying to flatter him. It was refreshing. As the evening wore on, George found himself more and more drawn to Cynthia. She wasn't like the women he usually pursued. She had depth, intelligence, and a sense of independence that intrigued him. When the night ended, George knew he didn't want this to be the last time they met. I've enjoyed talking to you, he said as they stood outside the bar. Can I have your number? I'd like to see you again. Cynthia hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, she said, taking his phone and typing in her number. But don't make me regret it. You won't, George promised with a smile. From that night on, George and Cynthia began seeing each other regularly. At first, their dates were casual. A walk in the park, dinner at a quiet restaurant, but as time went on they grew closer. Cynthia brought something new into George's life: warmth, authenticity, and a sense of normalcy that he hadn't experienced in years. Cynthia, in turn, was captivated by George's charm and intelligence. She saw a side of him that few others did, a man who could be thoughtful and caring when he wanted to be. She believed she was seeing the real George, the one hidden behind his wealth and power. For a while it seemed like they were building something special. Cynthia began to dream of a future with George, a life filled with love, partnership, and shared dreams. She thought she had found the man she would spend the rest of her life with. But George had other thoughts. While he enjoyed Cynthia's company, he couldn't shake his belief that she wasn't the woman he would eventually marry. In his mind, marriage was reserved for someone pure, someone who fit his ideal of the perfect wife. Cynthia, though wonderful, didn't align with that vision. Unaware of George's hidden intentions, Cynthia gave him her heart completely. She supported him, celebrated his successes, and stood by him through challenges. For her, their relationship was more than a fling. It was love. George, however, remained the man he had always been. While he was with Cynthia, he was attentive and affectionate, but when he wasn't with her, he was out indulging in the lifestyle he loved. Lavish parties, expensive drinks, and other women. He didn't feel guilty because, in his mind, he wasn't committed to Cynthia in the way she thought he was. For 5 years, Cynthia remained devoted to George. She believed in him, in their relationship, and in the future she thought they were building together. But for George, Cynthia was just another chapter in his life, a part of his journey but not his destination. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of George's penthouse, Cynthia brought up the topic of marriage. George, she began, her voice soft but steady, we've been together for so long. Don't you think it's time we talked about the future? George looked out at the city lights, avoiding her gaze. He knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready for it. Cynthia, he said carefully, I care about you. But I don't think I'm ready for marriage yet. Cynthia's heart sank. Not ready, she asked, her voice trembling. George, it's been 5 years. How much longer do you need? George hesitated, struggling to find the words. Finally he said, I'm sorry, Cynthia. I don't think you're the right person for me to marry. The words hit Cynthia like a thunderbolt. She stared at him in disbelief, her heart breaking into pieces. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. After everything we've been through, after all these years, you're telling me I'm not the right person? George didn't reply. He couldn't. In his mind, he had always known this day would come. He just hadn't expected it to hurt as much as it did. That night, Cynthia left George's penthouse with tears streaming down her face. She had given him everything, her love, her time, her heart. And he had shattered it without a second thought. For George, it was just another ending, another chapter closed. But for Cynthia, it was the beginning of heartbreak she would carry for years to come. George's life continued as if nothing had happened. After ending things with Cynthia, he felt a sense of freedom. To him, relationships were always temporary, and he believed he had spared Cynthia from an inevitable disappointment. He didn't feel guilt, he felt relief. A few months later, George decided to turn his attention toward a new chapter of his life. He had achieved incredible success in his career, and now he was determined to find a wife. But not just any wife, she had to fit his ideal. Someone pure, untouched by the world, and aligned with his vision of perfection. George's newfound seriousness about settling down led him to church, a place he hadn't frequented in years. He believed that church would be the best place to find a woman who met his criteria. His reasoning was simple. The kind of woman he wanted wouldn't be at parties or bars. One Sunday morning, dressed impeccably in a crisp white shirt and navy trousers, George walked into a large modern church in the heart of the city. The congregation was vibrant and welcoming, and George couldn't help but notice how many young, beautiful women filled the pews. After the service, George lingered in the lobby, scanning the crowd. He had already caught the attention of several women, but none of them stood out. Just as he was about to leave, he saw her. She was standing with a group of friends, her modest dress and gentle smile setting her apart. Esther radiated kindness and humility. Her movements were graceful, her laughter soft but sincere. George was drawn to her immediately. "Who is she?" George asked one of the ushers, nodding toward Esther. "That's Esther," the usher replied. "She's a dedicated member here, very involved in our charity work. A good woman inside and out." George smiled. She seemed like exactly the kind of woman he was looking for. He approached her with his usual confidence. "Hi," he said, extending a hand. "I'm George. I couldn't help but notice you during the service." Esther looked up at him, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "Hello, George," she said politely, shaking his hand. "I'm Esther. I don't come here often," George admitted. "But I'm glad I did today. Would you mind if we talked for a bit?" Esther hesitated for a moment but then nodded. "Sure." Over the next few weeks, George made a point to attend church regularly. He struck up conversations with Esther after every service, slowly earning her trust. Esther admired George's charm and ambition, and though she initially found him a bit too smooth, she began to see a side of him that seemed genuine. "Esther," George said one afternoon after they had spent hours talking in the church garden, "I admire your faith and your heart. I've never met someone like you before." Esther smiled, her cheeks turning a faint shade of pink. "Thank you, George. I admire your dedication to your work. You're a very driven person." George took this as encouragement and decided to pursue her seriously. He was patient, respectful, and attentive, qualities he rarely displayed with other women. Esther appreciated his efforts and soon she began to fall for him. Months passed and their relationship grew stronger. George proposed to Esther in a grand but intimate ceremony, renting out a private garden and filling it with candles and flowers. Esther, overwhelmed with emotion, said yes. She believed George was the man God had sent for her. Their wedding was a lavish affair, attended by prominent figures from the business world and the church community. Esther walked down the aisle in a flowing white gown, radiating happiness. George stood at the altar, smiling confidently. But as the vows were exchanged, a storm brewed beneath the surface. George, despite his promises, hadn't truly changed. His attraction to Esther was more about fulfilling his idea of a perfect wife than about love. In the back of his mind, he still believed he could live the life he wanted while keeping Esther as his moral anchor. A few weeks after the wedding, George returned to his old habits. He began attending exclusive parties again, meeting women and indulging in the lifestyle he thought he had left behind. At first he was discreet, but it wasn't long before he was back to his old ways entirely. Esther, who loved George deeply, noticed the subtle changes. He came home late, avoided certain questions, and often seemed distracted. She chose to pray for him, believing that her love and faith could bring him back to the man she thought she had married. One day, as George sat in his office, lost in thought, his secretary informed him that someone was waiting to see him. "Who is it?" George asked without looking up. "It's Cynthia," the secretary said hesitantly. George froze. It had been nearly a year since he had seen Cynthia, and he wasn't prepared for this encounter. Cynthia walked into his office, her posture strong and her eyes filled with pain and anger. "George," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you." George gestured for her to sit, but Cynthia remained standing. 5 years, she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "You wasted 5 years of my life, George. And now you're married just like that." George sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Cynthia, I didn't mean to hurt you." You didn't mean to hurt me?" Cynthia interrupted, her voice rising. "Use me, George. You let me believe we had a future when you knew all along that I wasn't part of your plan. How could you do that to me?" George looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't handle things the right way." Cynthia's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I loved you, George. I gave you everything. And you threw me away like I was nothing." Before George could respond, Cynthia turned and walked out of the office, leaving him with a sinking feeling in his chest. That night, George sat alone in his penthouse reflecting on Cynthia's words. For the first time he began to question the choices he had made and the person he had become. But his reflection was short-lived. George's old habits were deeply ingrained and he wasn't ready to change. Little did he know his actions were about to catch up with him in ways he could never have imagined. Life for George began to take a peculiar turn just a few months into his marriage with Esther. He had returned to his old ways, slipping out to parties and indulging in affairs with other women. Despite Esther's unwavering love and faith, George's heart remained divided. But something strange began to happen. One evening, George was at an exclusive club, sitting in a private booth with a woman he had met just days before. As they laughed and drank, George suddenly felt a sharp pain in his chest. It wasn't severe, but it was enough to make him pause. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her expression turning to concern. George forced a smile, brushing it off. "I'm fine. Just tired, I think." The night continued, but the strange sensation lingered in the back of his mind. A week later, George found himself in a similar situation, this time in a hotel room with another woman. As they talked, George suddenly felt dizzy. His vision blurred, and before he could react, he slumped to the floor. The woman panicked, calling for help. By the time George regained consciousness, he was confused and disoriented. "What happened?" he muttered, holding his head. "You collapsed," the woman exclaimed, her voice trembling. "You need to see a doctor." George refused. He didn't want anyone finding out about his indiscretions, especially Esther. He chalked it up to stress and dehydration, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, the episodes became more frequent. Each time George was with a woman who wasn't his wife, he would feel an overwhelming weakness, followed by a collapse. At first he tried to ignore it, but as the incidents grew more severe, he became terrified. One evening, after yet another collapse, George sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. He couldn't understand what was happening. He had always been in perfect health, and now, without warning, his body seemed to betray him. He decided to confide in Esther. "Esther," he said one night as they sat in the living room, "I need to tell you something." Esther looked up from her Bible, concern etched on her face. "What is it, George?" George hesitated, his pride and guilt warring within him. Finally he said, "I've been struggling. I've been feeling weak, collapsing at random times. I don't know what's wrong with me." Esther's eyes widened. "Collapsing? George, why didn't you tell me sooner? We need to get you to a doctor." George shook his head. "I've been to the doctor. They can't find anything wrong with me. I think this is something else." Esther frowned. "What do you mean?" George hesitated again, but the weight of his guilt was too heavy to bear. "Esther, I haven't been faithful to you," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Esther's face fell, her expression a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "What are you saying, George?" "I've been with other women," George admitted, unable to meet her gaze. "But now, every time I'm with someone who isn't you, something happens to me. I collapse and I can't explain it." Esther was silent for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Finally she said, "George, this isn't just about your health. This is about your soul. You've broken our vows and now you're facing the consequences." She wiped her tears and stood. "We need to pray," she said firmly. That night, Esther prayed fervently for her husband. She asked God to reveal the source of his affliction and to bring him to repentance. George, though skeptical, joined her, desperate for answers. The following Sunday, Esther convinced George to meet with the church pastor. The pastor listened intently as George explained his situation, his face growing more serious with each passing moment. "George," the pastor said, "what you're experiencing is not physical. Spiritual. You've opened yourself up to consequences because of your actions. But there's hope. God can restore you if you truly repent." The pastor led them in prayer, asking for guidance and revelation. As they prayed, George felt a deep sense of conviction. He realized how far he had strayed, not just from his marriage but from his own moral compass. That night George had a vivid dream. In the dream he saw Cynthia standing in a dark room, her face filled with pain and anger. She spoke words he couldn't understand, but the emotion was clear: betrayal. George woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. He knew what he had to do. "Esther," he said the next morning, "I think I know what's happening. It's Cynthia. I hurt her deeply, and now I think she's the reason for all of this." Esther nodded, her expression resolute. "Then we need to find her. You need to make things right." Together they began searching for Cynthia. It wasn't easy. George had no idea where she was or how to contact her. Weeks turned into months, but Esther refused to give up. She believed that forgiveness was the key to breaking whatever curse had fallen on her husband. Finally, after months of searching, they found her. Cynthia was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the life she had once known. When George and Esther arrived at her door, Cynthia was shocked to see them. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice cold. George stepped forward, his head bowed. "Cynthia, I came to apologize. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, please forgive me." Cynthia's eyes filled with tears. "You think an apology can erase everything you did to me?" she demanded. "You think I can just forget the years I wasted, the pain I endured?" Esther stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Cynthia, I understand your pain. But holding on to this will only hurt you more. Please, for your sake and for George's, let go of the anger. Forgive him." Cynthia hesitated, her heart torn. Finally, she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can forget," she said. "But I'll try to forgive." As Cynthia spoke those words, George felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He thanked her profusely, tears streaming down his face. That night, for the first time in months, George slept peacefully. He woke up feeling lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew he had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild his life and honor the vows he had made to Esther. George's life after Cynthia's forgiveness was markedly different. It was as if a heavy cloud had lifted, allowing sunlight to filter into every corner of his existence. He felt free, but he also knew this freedom came with a responsibility: to change. For the first time in his life, George truly committed to introspection. He realized how much his actions had been driven by selfishness, pride, and the belief that his wealth gave him immunity from the consequences of his choices. Now, with Esther by his side, he was determined to rebuild his life, his marriage, and his relationship with God. Esther's unwavering love became George's anchor. She encouraged him to immerse himself in faith, attending church regularly and joining men's groups that focused on accountability and growth. At first, George found it uncomfortable. He wasn't used to opening up about his struggles, especially to other men. But as the weeks passed, he began to see the value in their shared experiences and wisdom. One evening, during a meeting, an older man named Mr. Jacobs shared a story about how his own arrogance and infidelity nearly destroyed his family. George listened intently, struck by how similar their stories were. "It's never too late to change," Mr. Jacobs said, looking directly at George. "But change isn't about words. It's about actions. You have to prove every single day that you're a new man." Those words stayed with George. He decided to take tangible steps to show Esther, and himself, that he was serious about turning his life around. The first step was addressing the people he had wronged. Cynthia was at the top of the list, but there were others. Former employees he had treated poorly, friends he had ignored, and even women he had used and discarded. George began reaching out, one person at a time. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he wanted to own his mistakes. Some people responded with anger, others with indifference, but a few were moved by his sincerity. One day, Esther found him sitting at his desk writing letters. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, George," she said softly. George looked up, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I couldn't do this without you, Esther. Thank you for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." George also focused on repairing his relationship with Esther. For years, he had taken her for granted, treating her love as a given rather than a gift. Now he wanted to show her how much she meant to him. He began spending more time at home, sharing meals and joining Esther in her daily prayers. He listened to her, really listened, and learned about her dreams, fears, and the things that made her happy. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the city lights, George took her hand. "Esther," he said, "I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But I promise you, from this day forward, I'll be the husband you deserve." Esther smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. I've already forgiven you, George. Now let's move forward together. Life, however, was not without its challenges. George's old habits didn't disappear overnight, and there were moments when he felt tempted to revert to his former ways. One such moment came when he attended a business conference in Dubai. Surrounded by luxury and excess, George was approached by a striking woman who made her intentions clear. In the past, George would have indulged without hesitation. But this time he thought of Esther, her kindness, her forgiveness, and her unwavering faith in him. He politely declined the woman's advances and excused himself, feeling a sense of triumph as he walked away. When he returned home, he told Esther about the encounter. It wasn't easy, he admitted, but I couldn't betray you again. Esther hugged him tightly. I'm proud of you, George. Every time you choose us, you're proving that you've changed. Over time, George's transformation became evident to everyone around him. His employees noticed a shift in his demeanor. He was kinder, more patient, and genuinely interested in their well-being. At church, he began mentoring younger men, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. He didn't shy away from his mistakes, using them as a testament to the power of redemption. Even his business practices changed. George started using a portion of his wealth to fund community projects, building schools and hospitals in underserved areas. He wanted his legacy to be one of generosity and impact, rather than selfishness and excess. One day, George received an unexpected visitor. It was Cynthia. She looked different, happier, more at peace. I wanted to thank you, she said, sitting across from him in his office. George was surprised. Thank me? For what? For apologizing, Cynthia said. It gave me the closure I needed to move on. I'm in a good place now, George. I've found someone who loves me for who I am, and I've started my own business. I'm happy. George smiled, genuinely relieved. I'm glad, Cynthia. You deserve all the happiness in the world. As she left, George felt a sense of closure. The wounds of the past had finally healed. Years passed and George and Esther's bond only grew stronger. They welcomed 2 children into their lives, a boy and a girl, and George devoted himself to being the best father he could be. Every night as he tucked his children into bed, he thought about how close he had come to losing everything. He realized that his wealth and success meant nothing without the love and trust of his family. One evening, as he and Esther sat together on the couch watching their children play, George took her hand. Thank you, he said. For what? Esther asked, smiling. For saving me, George replied. For showing me what real love looks like. Esther leaned her head on his shoulder. It was never me, George. It was God working through both of us. And I'm grateful every day that we found our way back to each other. George nodded, his heart full. He had learned the hard way that redemption wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about living differently, every single day. And now, surrounded by the love of his family, he knew he had finally found the life he was meant to live.